the idea of debating everything within 3 days has attracted the anger of some MPs who say it's simply not enough time to consider such an important bill. Let's discuss what we've heard so far today and the very important day ahead now with Joe Owen. He's the Brexit Programme Director for the Institute for Government, and with Anne McElvoy, who is a Senior Editor at The Economist. Thank you both very much for coming along. Both of you, do you think that this potentially, though, is the end of the road for Boris Johnson's deal? OK, MPs might vote to, for the programme, the deal in principle, but then when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the timetable for reviewing it, scrutinising it, put lots of blocks in his way.
Well, that's exactly what Number 10 fears, and why it's tried very hard to get this along the road to being approved very soon. Obviously, the more you're against it, the more time you're likely to want to have. It is a very complex bill. There is a very good case for taking longer of it. I think it's like one of those relationships where the trust is so broken down on both sides that the idea of giving more time just signals to Team Boris in Downing Street that sand will be thrown under the wheels, and we've seen Parliament, in fairness, and the Ben Act being used to that effect if you're of a different view, and you may not even be a radical Remainer. You just think, well, I'm an MP, I shouldn't be bounced into this. That statement there from the lobby briefing was quite interesting. We were all expecting a bit of a sort of, gun to the head, but I think Boris Johnson knows, his team now know, that the more they use that language, the more the argument becomes about the way Number 10 is handling MPs. There's huge anger among MPs, and it's equivalent to anything I've seen at any time about being used as hostages, as one put it to me. So I think he's softening the tone there, but in the end, he needs to really show that he can push this through. If he doesn't, then I think we're in a different course towards general election.
Maybe trying to build a little bit of goodwill in there. And just on that point of trust that Anne was making, Joe, on the flip side of that, the opposition don't trust Boris Johnson, do they? They think that, if somehow his deal gets through, then come the end of the transition period at the end of next year, the UK could be back in a position of leaving the EU without a deal if all the necessary negotiations can't be brought to fruition.
Yeah, that's right. And you can see that the opposition and even some of the kind of ex-Conservative backbenchers are focusing their attention on amendments for what happens next. And it is worth reflecting on. I mean, Theresa May would have killed for this opportunity for MPs to say yes in principle to her deal, but let's work through some amendments. So this is quite a big moment today if MPs do support second reading of the bill, the kind of agreement in principle. But then, as you said, we get into the nitty-gritty of amendments and how MPs are looking to try and kind of frustrate the government in the next phase. But the big question will be on timetabling.
Could you see, Anne, any parliamentary road left for Boris Johnson with this deal if indeed MPs don't support that programme motion, that timetable, over the next 3 days?
Well, we will know a few more things probably than we know now. We will know, it looks, for instance, like that customs union alternative was one of those amendments that was put forward previously. That seems to have lost some traction on the Conservative side. Labour still talks about a customs union, but that's a very vague and sort of futuristic scenario that Labour would be renegotiating a deal, and probably in Brussels they're not exactly raising a big fat glass of wine to that prospect. So I think we would know that where Parliament's what it didn't want and what it was pushing off the table, that will be Boris Johnson's argument. You really now have to go with this, or you bring forward a second referendum motion and try that. It is not impossible a second referendum motion would get through. I'm always told that the numbers are nearly there, but it's a bit of a paradox. They're never ever quite there, or at least not so far. I think really at that point, though, he would just say, you know what, call the whole thing off, give me a general election, and why are you standing in the way of it? And that's where the argument would go towards should you or shouldn't you.
So Joe, Phil Wilson of the Wilson-Kyle amendment on a second referendum told me earlier that he would back this deal if there is a second referendum attached. But do you think that Boris Johnson would even countenance that, or is he going to say no? Let's go for a general election.
I mean, that seems very unlikely that they would buy a general election and the government would have that, because that automatically delays leaving by possibly 6 months, because you would need to have the so-called confirmatory referendum before we actually left the EU. So it would also mean a very long extension. Just on other possible parliamentary routes through, if the programme motion goes down, the government can always bring back another programme motion that says, OK, we hear your concerns, and we will ask the EU for a short 2-week, 3-week, 4-week extension to just dot the I's and cross the T's, a so-called technical extension that Theresa May spoke about a few times. And at that point, it will come down a decision in number 10 as to whether they would rather say, MPs have stopped us getting to the 31st of October, let's have a general election, or whether they would rather kind of smell the finish line with a majority for the deal in principle and swallow the extra 2 or 3 weeks to be able to then have a general election, having done Brexit and left the EU.
It's a tactical chess game as we struggle here with the helicopter above us. It is all about tactics. It's move and counter move. What do you think is most likely? The government thinking, well, we're nearly there. Let's try and push for a technical extension, or is Boris Johnson going to stick to his avowed, do or die October 31st?
It's sort of do or die another day, isn't it? I think Joe's right that there is a possibility of asking for a technical extension, but I think it would have to be pretty short. My hunch, and this is really all it is at this point, is if you're starting to get towards another month, well, that emboldens those who are saying that this is so complicated, so difficult, there must be stuff in there that we can sort of get our spanner into and undo. I doubt that he'd be looking for a month extension. I could see if he could say, well, with a gun to my head, I've had to accept a short extension for Parliament to scrutinise. I don't think it would be anything like that. I don't think he'd accept it.
All right, Anne McElvoy, Joe Owen, thank you very much for giving us your thoughts on the possible permutations ahead today. Thank you again.